Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. I am Kristan McMahon, and I serve as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Our guest today, our first repeat guest, is David Crane, the founding prosecutor of the Special Court of Sierra Leone. And we're going to be talking about his experiences and also his book, Every Living Thing, Facing Down Terrorists, Warlords, and Thugs in West Africa, A Story of Justice. David, welcome back for more tea.
Hey, it's great to be back, and these are always a lot of fun, so it's good to speak with you.
Wonderful. So I want to start with what prompted you to write this book. If I remember from our conversations, it was perhaps someone had suggested to you, you really want to write down everything that's going to happen to you over the next couple of years.
Well, yeah, someone very smart, Colin Powell, mentioned to me as I was getting ready to go to West Africa as the chief prosecutor for the new International War Crimes Tribunal in Sierra Leone. He said, you're going over there to make history, and you might want to consider writing it down. And so I had never really thought about it. I was very busy doing a whole bunch of other things, but I did. And then I ended up with 4 handwritten volumes of my day-to-day experience, my entire time that I was there, and to include recording the weather, etc. So it was very, very helpful. So when I did sit down to write Every Living Thing, I had this diary, very detailed diary of what was going on, both the personal as well as the professional. And I think it gives the book a deep richness that you would normally not get. It's not a legal text per se. It is my experiences as a chief prosecutor of an international war crimes tribunal. Really, from a point of view of really the last time a prosecutor did this was Telford Taylor, who succeeded Robert Jackson at Nuremberg. Just coincidentally, other prosecutors have written books, but not a detailed account of daily life in an atrocity zone. So I felt it was important that I write this down for the people of Sierra Leone. Their story needed to be told, but also, and as if you get the book, you'll notice that it's dedicated to the wonderful people in the office of the prosecutor from 2002 to 2012 who dedicated their lives to seeking justice for the people of Sierra Leone.
Well, and I will admit, I was struck by a number of parallels when reading this book to how Justice Jackson was thinking and preparing for his trial almost 75 years ago. And one of the first things that immediately struck me is you were very clear in the beginning of your book that you had almost 2 years of prep work. And I was making the parallel to Justice Jackson, who had about 5 or 6 months, and thinking how far preparation for these trials had come. There was a lot that you needed to do in that 2-year span. So let's talk a little bit about that, because one of the main things that you were doing was a listening tour and really building up the public relations for this effort.
Well, again, and I want to really underscore, I don't compare myself in any way, shape, or form to that great man, Robert H. Jackson. I happen to be given the privilege of seeking justice for people who are in an atrocity zone. I happen to be the second American to be a chief prosecutor, but yeah, there is lots to be done. Now, I created a general strategy. Of course, I also had a prosecution strategy, and it was 10 phases: beginning, middle, and an end. I knew exactly where I was going, why I was doing it, who I was hiring, why I was investigating, who I was investigating, why I was investigating them, the charges, etc. So that I was really, when I arrived in Sierra Leone in August of 2002, I was literally in phase 3 of a 10-phase plan. So we began to just execute the plan. Of course, I had a more classified prosecutorial strategy. I didn't make that public, of course, but it takes a lot of work to do this right, because again, the stakes are so high. But the key is planning, having a good plan, having a good prosecutorial strategy, making sure that your people know what that strategy is and why they're there, where they're going, and what they're doing fits into the overall scheme. Now, Robert, but there are some very interesting parallels to this. In some ways, really, at Nuremberg, they put the tribunal right at the scene of the crime. at Nuremberg, where the destruction was wholesale and all around them. Same thing at the International War Crimes Tribunal in West Africa, the Special Court for Sierra Leone. We were right at the crime scene. When I arrived in Sierra Leone, there was no electricity, no running water. Bodies were still in the streets. The first thing I noticed when I stepped off the first commercial flight into Sierra Leone in years was the vultures and the smell of death. And I think Robert Jackson even mentions, even though unfortunately he didn't write the same book that I wrote, it would have been wonderful, wouldn't it, to have him write his day-to-day experiences. But, others who we've talked to who have had that experience, the smell of death lingers in these areas, and it certainly did the entire 3 years that I was in West Africa. So yes, I had the ability to follow a plan, and when we went into court and I gave my opening statement, I felt the presence of Robert Jackson as I was asked to come to the podium. And I had read extensively all that I could about him, how he was writing his opening statements, and had a great influence on me. So Robert Jackson was with me the whole 3 years that I was there in Freetown, Sierra Leone.
Well, and one of the things you mentioned about your plan, and I want to emphasize this for the students who are watching this, you had very low expectations that you would actually receive this post, that you would be awarded this post. And yet you started developing the plan anyway. So even with what you saw as fairly low chances that you would be named the chief prosecutor, you still developed this 10-point plan well in advance of that.
Well, again, yeah, I did, and it's important. You have to be humble in these things, and really, of all of the current and former chief prosecutors of the world's international courts, none of us expected to be called, as we call it, the call, to be a chief prosecutor of an international war crimes tribunal. In fact, I actually asked this question with several of us sitting around at the Chautauqua Institution during the International Humanitarian Law Dialogues. I said, did any of you actually ever apply or ask for the possibility of being a chief prosecutor? And, we're all sitting around having a beer or a wine or a tea or something, and you're all kind of looked at me, just being around. And it was fascinating. There were 8 of us, and not one of us sought, applied for, asked to be chief prosecutors of the various tribunals we were chief prosecutors of. All of us got a call asking whether we would like to do that. And we all had distinguished careers that we actually ended in order to step into a very, very dark door with a very dark room in the hopes that we could possibly bring justice to victims of atrocity. And so that's the courage involved in this, is that we literally changed our lives in order to go forward when we were given the privilege to do so. So that's really kind of fascinating as just that. So, I had no expectations during 2001, 2002, when all this process started, particularly in August of 2001, about literally 2 weeks before the planes went into the buildings, and the White House called me and asked if I was interested in being a chief prosecutor. I kind of laughed at him. At this point in time, just for reference, John Bolton, someone we all know, had just kind of, quote, unsigned us out of the Rome Paradigm system, the Rome Statute. And so, frankly, the world was, dare I say it, angry at America at the time. And we were starting to kind of confront the concept of the International Criminal Court in a way that was really offensive to lots of people. So my low expectation was the fact that I was an American, and there's just no way they're going to point an American to the head the world's first international hybrid tribunal. Despite that, I'm a planner. My reputation is creating new organizations and leading them to success. And Colin Powell said that's the reason why I got the job over time. But the point is that, I was just, if I don't get it, I don't get it. And if I do, I do. We largely had this thought through before I got the call in April of 2002 that I had been selected to be chief prosecutor. A week after I had been told that I wasn't going to get the job. So it was interesting. Most of my files were locked away in my cabinet in my office in DC, and I'd really, frankly, kind of forgotten about it until I got the call. It was funny. My secretary kind of comes around the corner, and her eyes are big, and she goes, "Mr. Crane, there's a Hans Corell on the line." Our good friend, Ambassador Hans Corell, who was the legal advisor to the UN, was on the line, and this was about 11:30 in the morning. And he said, "David, I'd just like to inform you that the Secretary General has selected you to be Chief Prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And would you accept?" And of course, I'd already told my wife that I wasn't going to get it. And so he said, "Well, we're going to be going down at noon to announce to the world this. Would you please accept?" And so what am I going to say? No, at this point. So I did say yes, and the rest is history.
It gives new meaning. There are a number of people who have spoken about when they are asked to work at the White House or something like that, they feel that that's a call that you cannot turn down. And in your case, it was the international community asking you to take this role on. So I have to imagine that is an even greater, how could you possibly say no moment.
Well, then I had to call my wife and say, "Oh, by the way."
So you alluded to this, but let's talk a little bit about how the world was viewing these international tribunals at this point. So up until Sierra Leone, we'd had Yugoslavia and Rwanda. They were chugging along. You mentioned in the book that I think it was Rwanda was already 8 years in when you were meeting with them. So it seems as if the world, the United Nations, recognized that something needed to be done in these instances. But you mentioned you felt as if the Sierra Leonean tribunal was sort of one of the first with a very clear mandate as to what to accomplish and a very hopefully clear but finite time frame in which to get that work done.
Well, again, the Special Court for Sierra Leone was the third major tribunal in the modern era. And we had, of course, obviously the ICTY and ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda that were in existence. So they began their work in 93, 94 timeframe, and they were, as you say, chugging along. But they're incredibly expensive and causing a lot of angst. People were asking very hard questions because of the cost. Is this worth it? And so, in the background of Yugoslavia and Rwanda is a 10-year tragedy going on in West Africa, a very dark corner of the world that nobody's really paying any attention to. This is the blood diamond story. And so when President Kabila wrote a letter to Kofi Annan saying, "I need your help, we've got to account for some horror here," and over time that created the Special Court for Sierra Leone, there was a clear signal. We are not going to create another ad hoc tribunal under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. We've got to do this a little bit more efficiently and effectively, or we're going to grind ourselves into the ground and we'll never do this again. And so they came up with this idea of a hybrid international war crimes tribunal located at the scene of the crime, and with a mandate that could work. I mean, really, the Rwanda and Yugoslavia tribunals had very broad mandates. Prosecute those who were responsible for the horror stories in Rwanda and Yugoslavia, whereas I was given a very, very workable mandate. Prosecute those who bear the greatest responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And so that allowed me to very quickly narrow my thinking, who to prosecute and why. And so I chose to, and this was entirely my decision, and the first time ever that the term greatest responsibility was actually activated. It's now largely the standard by which most tribunals will be set up or how they do their work. But at the time, this was a very new concept. And what it ended up doing is I go back to Nuremberg and Robert H. Jackson's decisions as to who to prosecute. It's basically the leadership of the warring factions in that 10-year civil war in Sierra Leone, the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, the Civil Defense Force, and of course, the infamous Revolutionary United Front. So again, the world was a lot smarter at this. And of course, it was new. And then you can kind of see the tie-in because it was new, because it was a new idea, it was a new model, and they were looking for someone who could efficiently and effectively create this court in a way that was affordable in an overspent count. that's where all of a sudden I began to put two and two together. Is that's why I was unwittingly at this point a strong candidate, is because Colin Powell was pushing my candidacy, saying, if you want to get this done right and efficiently, here's your guy. And of course, he told me that years later as to what he was doing behind the scenes, which I knew nothing about. So anyway, that's important, because again, just to compare, $125 million per tribunal, which is 200, if I do the math right, is $250 million a year times, at the time, 8 years. The states parties of the UN were getting a little testy about the cost. And so we ended up, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, the third tribunal, ended up costing around $30 million a year versus $125, $130 million a year. So we did show, with a little bit of planning, with a little bit of focus and reshaping, that you can do this efficiently and effectively. And I think historians are already starting to write about the fact that that the Special Court for Sierra Leone was, from an efficiency and effectiveness point of view, one of the more successful tribunals.
Well, and you also were largely in charge of doing your own fundraising as well. I mean, I don't know exactly how the funds were raised for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, but it occurred to me just from reading your book that you and your team were really out there making those connections with the various member states. Certainly a lot of work back here in the United States with foreign ops proponents to help get budget line items into the foreign ops bills as well. And so that must have also been a lot of pressure to not only be doing the work that you needed to do, but also be trying to find the funds that you needed in order to do the work.
It was, and you have to deal with the situation that you're handed. You can't wish something to go another way. You have to just deal with the way it is. And our job, Robin Vincent, our registrar, and the president of the court, and I, as the senior members of this international tribunal, our job, among other things, not only to prosecute those who bear the greatest responsibility, but also to go out and raise $25–30 million a year. And really, it ended up being not so bad. Yeah, we had to work at it, and yes, I had to get out there, but that was just part of an ability to talk to people anyway and get their perspectives. And the funds did come in. The only problematic country that I had was the United States. Their intent really was to, let's get an American guy in there. He'll take care of, maybe prosecute 5 or 6 people, get it done, not rock the boat. And this was reflected to me afterwards when I came back. We'll just get this done and get it out of the way, and do this cheaply as well as we can. And even though in the actual statute it said I could prosecute heads of state, well, again, when you get handed the mandate, it's a deep honor. I all of a sudden didn't become an American lackey. I became a chief prosecutor of an international tribunal, sworn to seek justice. And so I went off and sought justice. And that irritated the Bush administration at so many levels. In fact, frankly, I still think in the Africa division, I think my picture's up there and they use it as a dartboard, because I tell you, I took down Charles Taylor, president of Liberia, and the Bush administration was very, very angry. The Colin Powell ran political cover for me, as did a bipartisan Congress who also ran political cover. But every once in a while, I'll just give this as a vignette. When I took down Charles Taylor, the Congress of the United States had given, in a foreign ops bill, had given the State Department $12.5 million to give to the Special Court for Sierra Leone. It had been authorized, appropriated, and passed into a bill, the foreign ops bill, and they had the money, but they withheld us getting that money. And we were about 2 months from closing the doors. We needed that 12 point, that's almost half of what we needed every year. And so I flew back to the United States and went and saw Judd Gregg and Patrick Leahy, senators from New Hampshire and Vermont, and told them the problem. And they said, hey, we got it, no problem. They both went down to the floor of the Senate and promptly withheld all the funds to the new embassy in Sierra Leone until the State Department coughed up that $12.5 million. So, sometimes you have to kind of work the system, but that was really the only time that it was really close. After that, after our successes really began to be racked up and we were really, people began to realize this really is succeeding, we didn't really have a lot of problem persuading many nations to contribute. I mean, we had nations from the Netherlands, Canada, the United States, Great Britain, who were major supporters of it. But we went all the way down. Philippines, God bless them, gave us $5,000 a year. The point is that they were contributing, and they were working with our management committee, which coordinated these kind of fundraisings. But yeah, it's a very interesting. I didn't realize I could do that. I've been a public servant all my life, 30 years in the federal government of the United States. So, I didn't do any fundraising, but I found I was pretty good at it.
Nice. Well, and let's, so you've alluded to some of the challenges of the trial itself too. So let's turn to that. One of the things that it seemed in your book was important to you, and obviously to the Sierra Leoneans, was having local involvement in this effort. And you mentioned specifically that one of the Sierra Leonean attorneys gave part of the opening statement. Also, the Sierra Leoneans were involved because you literally had to build the courtroom from the ground up. That was part of the pride that they were taking in this process.
I think it's critical. It would be wonderful if every tribunal could be at the scene of the crimes. The system seems to be that's not so. The Hague seems to be the center point. That's fine. But yeah, we were right there. And so the people, the victims, which this is all about, really, at the end of the day, we're doing this to seek justice for the victims. And the victims can see their prosecutor stand in front of them through our outreach program and explain to them what's going on and why they're doing it, answer their questions. If they can see Sierra Leoneans literally building the courtroom by which I was going to prosecute the individuals who just terrorized that part of the world for 10 years, and we saw the murder rate, maybe and mutilation over 1.2 million human beings. But to see that court rise out of the ground in front of them, and then to see all of that happen, and then be allowed freely to go into the court. I remember sitting at my window watching Sierra Leoneans on a daily basis once we were in trial. Some of them being carried, they had no arms, no legs. Some of them were blinded, just tortured and mutilated by the RUF and the AFRC and CDF, going up into their courtroom built by them to see the individuals who had such horrific control of their lives for a decade being prosecuted and humbled before the law. And that's powerful stuff. It's just powerful stuff. And to this day, it means great pride at the hard work that all my people did to bring justice for these people. I used to like to say to the press that, I don't really do much of anything. All I do is walk around and look pretty. It's the great people who are in court every day, proving each and every element of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt, seeking justice for the people. But the people of Sierra Leone were sitting in that audience every single day. The victims coming forward as witnesses, testifying bravely in front of these individuals, telling their stories. It was just, I thought this is, when I went to law school, this is the most obvious power. I mean, I was so impressed with the power of the law. With the stroke of my pen, I took down the most powerful warlord in Africa and humbled him before the law. President Blaise Compaoré of Burkina Faso, the guys that created the Blood Diamond story. This is what this was. We broke up the Blood Diamond cabal and took most of the players either through prosecutions or they are working for me. In other words, I recruited a lot of some of these guys who actually went to court and fingered everybody, or for some reason they died or were killed by others. But looking back on it, 90% of the individuals in the Blood Diamond story were either prosecuted, worked for me, or died by inappropriate circumstances. But anyway, the bottom line is those characters aren't around anymore, or they are tried fairly and openly in a court of law and are now serving lengthy sentences.
Well, and from reading in your book, it sounded as if giving the citizens of Sierra Leone, or the Sierra Leoneans, an opportunity to tell their stories, whether that was to you personally in the town halls or to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that was really a big part of your effort. And you actually set up a unique relationship with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that they could freely tell their stories there and they would not be used by you to prosecute them.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's important. You know, I thought it was, looking back on it now, kind of funny, but you know, about a year before I actually went to Sierra Leone, and really just a couple months after I had been selected to be chief prosecutor, the academics, practitioners saying, and there's no way you can have a truth commission and an international tribunal working side by side in a small country in a dark corner of the world and not get in their way, screwing up the evidence, mixing witnesses, et cetera. And so in July of a month before I actually went to Sierra Leone, I announced to the world that I wasn't going to use any evidence that the Truth Commission was going to garner in this domestic effort. And really, the Truth Commission was a domestic entity created by the peace agreement that ended the Civil War. But I wasn't going to do anything that would impede them, even though frankly I did have the power in their quest for the truth. And I encouraged all Sierra Leoneans, and I did this for 3 years, encouraging them by the thousands to go before the Truth Commission and tell their story, because it's really important for our listeners to understand who've not been in this experience. You know, the victims want to tell their story. I remember a very powerful moment. I'd only been in Sierra Leone for a month. This was my first town hall in the fields, people who worked to death. And I'm standing in front of about 300 former RUF combatants and others. And this guy came up to me, and he was missing his leg. And he hobbled up to me, and he put his hand on my shoulder to rest. And he said, could I please tell you what happened to me? And that just struck me. I mean, just right to my heart. You know, this guy is ruined for life. You know, we're in a part of the world, there's no social structure. So this guy is not going to get any help with that leg. He said, can I tell you what happened to me and my family? And so I patiently listened to him tell him the story. It's a great picture of him doing that. The photographer took a picture of me, and I looked him dead in the eye, and just for 10 minutes, he told me that. And I looked him in the eye, I said, I will seek justice for you. I will get those who did this or created the conditions to do that. So I think that's really, really important as just as a small vignette to the point.
Well, and you made so in going back to some of your decision-making capabilities, you made some additional sort of first in time or certainly unique decisions with regard to this. So one was your decision to focus on crimes against women as one of the major tenets of the crimes that you were prosecuting.
Yeah, you know, it's really, you know, people who understand the history of this, crimes against women have not really been given the center point by which they deserved and should have been prosecuted. Yes, we had instances in Rwanda and some in Yugoslavia, none in Nuremberg. And, you know, of course, you know, the gravamen of the offenses in West Africa centered around women and children. This is the bushwives. This is the child soldiers, 30,000+ of them who were the main combatants of this. And so I decided as I was developing my prosecutorial strategy over and above my general strategy, that I was going to make gender crimes the center point of my indictments. And I was going to show the world that women pay a particularly brutal price, particularly in the dirty little wars of the 21st century. And so I wanted to send a signal to all those who are contemplating conflict or are in conflict. If you go after the women, you will be held accountable. And so we did that. And you can look at a law in this area to include a new crime against humanity, forced marriage in times of armed conflict, which captured more of the bushwife phenomenon. You know, we were already about to go to trial. Our indictments had already been issued. We had all our individuals arrested and incarcerated. We were getting ready to go to trial. We'd already been granted our joint trial motions, so we had 3 trials going. And so we decided to literally, we were sitting around one day, and every Friday afternoon, I would bring all my team together and we would sit around and talk about the week that happened, the week ahead. And I said, look, I have a particular issue, and that is I don't think we're capturing in our indictments the gravamen of the offense of what has happened to the bushwives, who were women and girls driven into the bush, worked as cattle, worked as animals, and when they were no longer abused, they were bred, worked, they were put down. And I said, we have rape, we have sexual slavery, we have terrorism, we have all of the generalized crimes that you normally see, but this isn't capturing what these women went through by the tens of thousands. Many, literally at the time, many of which were still in the bush with their bush babies. In other words, they were impregnated by their captors. And so we just went around and discussed it. And so Adua Waialfa, a barrister on my trial team, said, why don't we call it forced marriage in times of armed conflict? And we're all sitting around thinking that through. And I said, I think that's doable. And I turned to my erstwhile deputy prosecutor, Sir Desmond de Silva, Queen's Counsel. And I looked at him, and he goes in his very, very patrician British accent, said, David, I think we've got it. And so we amended our indictments, much to the howling of the defense counsel. But of course, when you look at statutes, and you look at the statutes for all of the tribunals, in their crime against humanity section, you also have usually the very last paragraph that delineate examples of crimes and other inhumane acts, which to a good lawyer, that's a garage door opening to, and it allows a chief prosecutor to deal with facts that a creative body such as the UN just don't understand or don't know. And so we amended our indictments to say other inhumane acts, to wit, forced marriage in times of armed conflict. And there was appeals immediately. It's not a crime. It wasn't a crime at the time that it was committed. All of the important litigated type issues, and we expected those, and we prevailed. And I am very proud to say that those who were charged with forced marriage in times of armed conflict were found guilty of forced marriage in times of armed conflict, and on that particular charge, the appellate chambers upheld those convictions. And so now, in a general rule, we now have a new crime against humanity related to a gender crime called forced marriage in times of armed conflict.
Yeah, quite trailblazing there. And you also utilized perhaps an underused crime of pillaging and plundering.
Well, again, you hear about it. It sounds, you hear it in movies, pillaging and plundering and stuff, those kind of things. It tends to get watered down, to be honest with you. But I'm telling you, when the RUF would move into a village, these child soldiers, who they unleashed, all of them hopped up on some type of drug, would go and just rip the place apart, literally by their hands, not just burning, but just tearing the place apart, to include any human being they could get their hands on, or frankly, any live animal. They would just literally tear the place down. And, frankly, though most of the charges were problematic. I mean, we had good evidence, but pillaging and plundering was easy to find representational charges to take these guys down, because they went in Operation No Living Thing, and this is where the title of my book comes from. Hinka Norman, who was the paramount chief, walked in and he wanted his entire chieftain destroyed because they were sympathetic to the government. And even though he at the time was a deputy minister of defense, he had this group called the Civil Defense Force that he was running on the side, who was countering the RUF, and which he was a head of, made up largely of hunting societies within that region. And he ordered them in an operation called No Living Thing to kill everything down to the ants. And so they moved into this area, Pujahun, which was his primary center of his chieftainship. And they tore it down, killed everything. But he shows up a couple days later, and there's a couple dogs walking around. In fact, there's a couple of humans walking around. And he is furious, and he got his fighters together, and he was yelling at them. He said, "I told you." This is just direct testimony out of our from witnesses who heard this during the trials. He said, "I told you, I wanted you to kill every living thing." So the title of the book, but also it shows you the horror of that terrible, terrible Civil War. Can you imagine?
I cannot. That's a level of atrocity that the vast majority of the world will never need to confront, and therefore is very hard to contemplate that reality.
It is. In fact, it's interesting, just real quickly, it was very difficult. And in my opening statement against the Civil Defense Force, I told the tribunal in my opening statement that you're going to have to believe the unbelievable. There are things that I'm going to show you that is hard to believe and understand. And there's nothing in any language that can describe the pain and suffering that the people of Sierra Leone went through. And so I just told them, you're just going to have to believe the unbelievable, which riffed off a comment made by Ignacy Schwarzbart, who was holed up in the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II, when he wrote a letter to the World Jewish Congress in New York saying, they're killing us all. Believe the unbelievable. And so I picked up on that and used that in my opening statement in Sierra Leone.
Well, and just as important as the crimes that you chose to prosecute were also what you chose not to prosecute. And I'm thinking most specifically of the child soldiers that you have mentioned a few times.
Well, again, I was confronted with, literally tens of thousands of largely young men between the ages of 6 and 15-ish. And I had been given under the statute the authority to prosecute any child between the ages of 15 and 18 for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I made the decision, just as a matter of law, that no child has the mens rea, the mental ability to understand, commit a war crime, commit a crime against humanity. No child has the ability to commit an international crime. And so I announced that in one of my town hall meetings about 4 months into my work there in November of 2002, before a group of 600 child soldiers who were now trying to go to school between the ages of 7 and 18, who had never learned how to read and write. All they were just feral animals. So I announced to the world that I wouldn't prosecute them or any child soldier who was part of this horror, because they were as much victims as the victims. And that sent an amazing signal around the world. And literally all 600 of them burst into tears. It's the first time they'd ever been shown. I asked later, they said, well, it's the first time they've ever been shown mercy. In 2002. In 2016, I was giving a master's class in The Hague about how to set up a tribunal, go figure. And we were taking a break on our first day. And a tall young man came up and shook my hand and said, "Mr. Crane, I just want to tell you, thank you. You saved my life." I said, "Well, how did I do that?" And he goes, "I was one of those young men sitting in that field in Kabbalah in 2002. And I just want to tell you, I just got my master's of law degree from the University of Alabama in the United States. And I just want to thank you." And he reached over and hugged me. And it was quite an emotional moment there.
I can imagine.
It's amazing. Most of us don't have, we go through life trying to do the best we can, but, rarely do you have someone come back around and say that. And that was a first for me, just to see that decision change the lives, hopefully, of a lot of young men who had no hope by any means, who now perhaps, I'd like to think that maybe more than just one of those 600 had some kind of fighting chance after that day.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about Operation Justice, which I think one of the things that interested me about that was, well, two main things that interested me about that. One, that Charles Taylor was not part of Operation Justice. And that two, you were very clear that you wanted at least 2 solid charges for anybody you were going to move forward on an indictment with. And so it really sounds as if you were trying to make sure those indictments were as bulletproof, for lack of a better phrase, going into that operation as possible.
Well, the book goes into great detail on the whole concept of Operation Justice, why Operation Justice, and things like that. Because again, I learned pretty early on that I was going to have to take down every single person that I was going to indict immediately, together, all at once. That was one point. I also realized that because Charles Taylor was in the country next door, that I wasn't going to be able to take him down on that day. In fact, he never even knew that he'd been indicted. I sealed that on the day that I announced the arrest and the jailing of all of those individuals. So again, I had to deal with that, and I took him down later on in June, Charles Taylor. But again, in March of 2003, just 6 months after I'd arrived, and also that was the end of phase 4 of my plan. In other words, it was all planned out. I'd been working to set up Operation Justice, mainly with the United Kingdom, because Sierra Leone used to be a former member. But I actually used an Operation Justice to take everybody down in one 55-minute arrest operation across the region. I used elements of the British Parachute Regiment, the Royal Navy, American Helicopter Company, Pakistani Special Forces, and also the potential riot control police of the Sierra Leone National Police to take all these guys down. We took them all down in one 55-minute arrest operation at noon. By 1 o'clock, all of them were in custody and on helicopters being flown to Blunt Island, 125 kilometers south of Freetown, on a detention facility that we had secretly built, where they stayed until we were able to build the detention facility at the court itself. And so they were all under arrest. Like I said, I sealed the indictment against Charles Taylor because I didn't want him meddling, because he was a sitting head of state, and I was concerned from a security point of view that he might invade Sierra Leone to try to destroy the court. And so that was very, very critical in my thinking, and also just shows you how you have to think all of these things through. When you're prosecuting at the international level, there's a political aspect of your thinking, and also a practical, a cultural, and a legal and diplomatic side to what you're thinking is, and you have to take it all into consideration. Taking down a sitting head of state, the first in the modern era, you have to think that through very, very carefully and then act accordingly. So that's what I was doing throughout all of this, was to making sure that I didn't just tear I didn't tear West Africa down by doing what I was doing. But I worked very, very carefully with Great Britain, the United States, Pakistan, obviously the UN, and Sierra Leone to make that happen, Operation Justice. And, for some of your listeners, they'll understand that, sometimes there's nothing wrong with being lucky. Granted, we planned this thing through, but also we were very, very, very lucky. But there wasn't a shot fired. And when I announced to the people of Sierra Leone that all of those senior members of the warring factions are now in our custody, waiting a fair and open trial, as I was driving back from the UN headquarters back to my headquarters in my armored vehicle, people started spilling out into the streets, celebrating, and they partied and danced all night because they realized for the first time in a long, long time that the law prevailed. And so it was a very, very, very exciting moment. Again, the beauty of this book, and again, I'm not trying to hawk the book, is all that detail is in there. I wrote all that down. I was able to put it in the book so that the reader isn't reading a legal text, he's reading the richness of all of the things that I've kind of alluded to in the tea today.
Well, and one of the things so you mentioned a few times how Charles Taylor, you had a couple of opportunities to arrest him. One of the things that I also found interesting in there, and you are very open in the book as to the people who were supportive and the people who were not as supportive or even actively tried to block you. And one of the things I did find interesting is that the State Department was trying to figure out if there was a way to give Charles Taylor a deal where he would step down, presumably, from being president of Liberia. And again, I would assume and would not be prosecuted if you were to decide to do that. That's, I guess, sort of what I'm guessing the deal was. But that just struck me as an interesting tactic for the State Department to be pursuing as you are pursuing your own stream of justice.
Well, it's interesting that that idea was floated by me by the ambassador at large for war crimes issues, Pierre Prospers. And I said, not only no, but hell no. I said, I'm going to take him down and prosecute him. And I'm going to let the world know that if you start doing this and getting my way, I'll let the world know what you're doing. And so again, they didn't do it, and they had to scramble about setting up a kind of, when we did take him down, he was removed from power based on my indictment. He was moved to Calabar, Nigeria in some type of quasi house arrest and kept there while the world decided what to do next. And it took me 70% of my time over the next 2 years to get the political basis by which he was handed over to us and then prosecuted, and now he's serving the rest of his life in Her Majesty's maximum security prison in England, in a place where I don't think the sun actually shines. It's near Berwick upon Tweed. If you've ever been up there, it's beautiful countryside and very green because it rains about 360 days of the year there. But yeah, it was a challenge. Now, one of the things, kind of a footnote, it's in the book as well, is, I was very confident in, and that's why I could tell the United States to go to hell, is because I had secretly, unbeknownst to the United States, gone and talked to almost every sitting head of state, the ministers of justice and foreign ministers. I'd secretly gone to almost all the West African countries and chatted with them about what they thought justice was for the people of Sierra Leone, whether Charles Taylor should be indicted and held accountable, etc. And they would tell me, yes, he should be. I think you're moving in the right direction. I didn't reveal my hand or anything. It's unethical for me to talk about my cases, but just get their general sense politically as to what should I do with Charles Taylor. Of course, they didn't know at the time. I'd already indicted him, sealed the indictment, so it wasn't public knowledge. But Charles Taylor was going to go down pretty soon, just a matter when I chose to do it. But I went with every one of them. I said, look, at the end of our discussions over tea or vodka or a drink or coffee or whatever, I would say, Mr. President, if you could just do me a favor, please. Should I indict Charles Taylor, had my fingers crossed, would you do nothing? In other words, I don't want you to publicly take a position, but it would be of great benefit to me if you just didn't publicly say anything. And they thought for a second. They said, yeah, we could do that. And so if you go back to the record, when I did take him down in the 3rd of June or 4th of June of 2003, in front of all of the world at the Lome Peace Accord, in front of his own fellow presidents, he went up the steps at 11 o'clock, president of Liberia. He went down the steps at 11:05 after I held a press conference, an indicted war criminal. He got the point, but I was confident because then the world reacted, of course. Half the world wanted me thrown out. Half the world wanted to give me the Nobel Peace Prize. But but if you look at the record, no West African head of state publicly denounced me. The only surprise I had in this whole, I didn't think Nigeria would do it because there were another country that were quietly working behind the scenes to block me as well for other reasons. But the one head of state in Africa that just blew my mind was Thabo Mbeki of South Africa. He went ballistic. Because, this is the first head of state in the good old boys club of African heads of state that was taken down publicly for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And Thabo Mbeki held a press conference and just ripped me apart. And he even called me a minor bureaucrat. Of course, the next day when I was holding a press conference about all this, one of the members of the press asked me, Mr. Crane, Thabo Mbeki called you a redneck racist, but he also called you a minor bureaucrat. So I pounded the lectern and I said, I am not a minor bureaucrat. I am a major bureaucrat. And everybody laughed, and but it just shows you, you can plan for everything and try to work it, but it's important for people to understand the politics of this with a small p, not a big p. There's no influence here trying to get me to decide certain ways. That's why I could take on the United States and just tell them to go to hell, because I was strong in my position. The region wanted me to take this guy down. Of course, I'd also talked to, obviously other major players, United Kingdom, Canada, the Netherlands in particular, and what have you. I was getting signals that should that happen, that they would back me, but the United States was not happy. In fact, for the first time since Somalia, sent in a Marine Expeditionary Unit because again, Charles Taylor was taken down, and so they had to stabilize the country. And of course, Liberia is kind of is more aligned to the United States back in the 1820s when we created Liberia. That's why under President Monroe, that's why it's called Monrovia. Yep. U.S. felt compelled they had to do something to stabilize, and they brought in, and then the UN brought in their peacekeeping force, and Charles Taylor was handed over or to Nigeria to be put under house arrest.
We have a couple questions from our audience. So I'm going to start with those since we are about 10 minutes before the hour. And the first is from Sarah Michelle, and she asked, did you ever fear for your personal safety while you were in this role?
Well, again, you're at the scene of the crime. You've got particularly the first, let's see, I arrived in August of 2002, and we took everybody down, all the bad guys, in March of 2003, other than Charles Taylor. So they were walking around fat, dumb, and happy, really thinking that they weren't going to be held accountable. And so there are a lot of bad guys, and in that whole part of the world. Did I fear? No, I didn't fear. Was I aware? Of course I was aware, but I was well protected. I had a UN and a Sierra Leonean close protection detail. It was a mixture. A runner. I was a runner then, and I got up and ran every morning. And so to be on my detail, you had to be able to run 5 miles with a weapon. Or you couldn't be on my detail because, what's good as a close protection officer if you can't breathe, let alone shoot? So again, that was part of it. But was there an issue? Of course, AK-47s could be bought for a pack of cigarettes in that area. This was diamond dealers, gun runners, thugs of all kinds moving all about West Africa. This was a very, very dark, forgotten part of the world when I stepped in to seek justice for the people of Sierra Leone. So there were a lot of ne'er-do-wells, to include people like Vladimir Menon and Victor Bout, the Lords of War. That movie with Nicolas Cage is about that time that I was there. And we actually cornered and took down both of those guys as well. And of course, the US and various other countries went after these two as well, and basically took down their businesses as part of all of this as some kind of collateral action. It took a couple of years, but bottom line is that we ran them out of business as well. So yeah, security was a challenge. The one thing I was mostly concerned about is security of my people, because we all lived in and around Freetown. So they were living in secured facilities. They were working in a very secured facility, because my concern was one of them being kidnapped and then mailed back to me one piece at a time to get me to drop charges. But that didn't happen. Were there threats? Yes, but again, that's just part of the job. And if you can't deal with that kind of pressure, then you shouldn't be in that kind of job. But I was confident in the people who were protecting me. And of course, I'm an old special operations officer. I was as good a shot as any of those guys. And so I actually had a weapon myself in front of me in the seat of my car, so that if we ever got ambushed, I would also join the fight. Because that's just the way it was. So I was confident in my ability to fight back if I had to. If we got ourselves into a gunfight, I'd been in gunfights before, and so this is just another gunfight.
We have a question from Helena Yearly, and is there a template in how prosecutors approach the pursuit of justice in international conflicts, or is it more driven by the culture of the community of victims?
Well, again, when you have the privilege of being asked to be an international prosecutor, you have to you take into consideration about 5 things. One of which is the law and the legal aspect of that. That's kind of a given. But as I've alluded to, you also have to take into effect the political, the diplomatic, the cultural, and the practical aspects of your strategy, but also what you're doing on a daily basis. So that's very, very important. You have to have a strategy. Why you're there. What's your mandate? And then, what kind of crimes you're looking at, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, it's very, very critical that a chief prosecutor be not only a good lawyer, but he has to be a good manager, a good leader, a good politician, and a good diplomat. And recently, the committee that was selecting nominees to be the Chief Prosecutor of the National Criminal Court, the third prosecutor to succeed our good friend Fatou Bensouda, blew it and nominated 4 inexperienced, distinguished people in their own right, but had no experience as prosecuting at the international level. And this is an absolute error on their part. And I think the world is beginning to react to these individuals. We've been operating now for about 25 years in dealing with international criminals and putting them in jail. We have a very, very deep bench of experienced senior people who could take over as chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court fairly easily, because they've been there, done that. Chief prosecutors are available. Of course, no American could ever do it because we're not part of the system. But this is a doable thing, and the selection committee failed. And I'll say that publicly, and I've already just written an op-ed on this. They failed the system. And now we have 4 individuals who are good lawyers, but they have never done this before. Now, the third prosecutor is going to stumble into their job, and the International Criminal Court is going to stumble on. And I'm very concerned, because someone who admires and believes in the concept of the International Criminal Court, I'm constantly amazed at the inability of the state's parties to actually pull this off. And it's been since 2002. They've been doing this for 18 years, and they continue to stumble.
I want to end on, I guess, a somewhat personal note. As you've mentioned throughout the book, you weren't just recording your experiences, but you were also recording what was going on around you. And there are really a lot of interstitials about your wife, Judy, and your kids, and what was going on in their lives and your good friends. And was that a way for you, when you were writing this, to sort of have those home touch points? Or what in terms of including that in a diary of what is going on in Sierra Leone, that would seem to be a bit unusual. So what was your thinking when you were including what was happening at home?
Well, the book is a tribute to the people of Sierra Leone, my office, the office of the prosecutor, but also to my family. I left. I was gone for 3 years. Now, granted, I was part of their lives, and I would see them at appropriate times. But one of the things that I told my people, that family is first. Family is important. There were no families in our office. Nobody could bring their families. I mean, when they came and worked for me, their families were, tens of thousands of miles away, and so we were all alone together as a team. We worked together, and we tried to create our own little family atmosphere there. But the family stayed. Where they were, and my family did the same thing, and so it was a particularly difficult. It's very hard. And so I think it was important for readers to understand that this just isn't aspects to this, and so I felt important to show how all of our families in my office sacrificed so much. I would use an example of my wonderful family that sacrificed so much. But I was home at the right time. I had a chance to walk my daughter down the aisle. Literally a month after I took Charles Taylor down, I went from hell on earth to the most amazing and important thing that I've ever done, is walk my beautiful daughter down the aisle in July of 2003. And so again, it's important to the reader to understand that all of this, and I think that's the again, I'm not trying to hawk the book, but I think we're looking back on it, the exciting part of the book is it does show the reader that it isn't just about law, it's about life, and hopefully the book does that for the reader. Is that it's a multi-dimensional kind of approach to showing that it's important to seek justice for people of atrocities.
Thank you, David. So I also want to announce to our audience a special programming note. So on August 8th, which is a Saturday, the Jackson Center and its partners will be hosting a free live global webinar to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the signing of the London Agreement and Charter, which established the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. David will be one of the Jackson Center panelists, and we are partnering with friends in London and Nuremberg. So it really is a global experience from those three touch points. And we're calling it The Age of Robert H. Jackson, London, Nuremberg, and Today. So you can sign up on the Jackson Center website, which is roberthjackson.org. Really hope that you will tune in for this special webinar. It is my first webinar, so hopefully technologically everything will go smoothly. And I also want to announce next week we will be talking with Riaz Kanji, who is a leading trial and appellate litigator on behalf of Indian nations. And we'll be talking about the recent Supreme Court's opinion in McGirt, as well as tribal sovereignty. So please join us next Thursday at 3 p.m. And David, thank you so very much for being with us today.
It's been my pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.